Smitty was telling you about the book that I'm working on right now. It's the first book in a series of 5 or 6 books, and it's got a very steampunky feel, which means that it's got modern elements to a very old-fashioned story. Most of the story is set in the Victorian era Scotland in the first book, and there are automatons. An automaton is kind of like a robot. And there is a very funky, steamy old house, and there's all kinds of cool things that are happening in that story. Yes.
Were you ever a pirate?
No. Well, possibly. In a past life. It's hard to say. Yes.
Is there any other ways that different ideas that made you think of the story?
Well, you remember I told you the story about Miss Zephyr's notebook? So that story I wrote, that's the only story that I have published for kids that's not historical fiction. That's set in the present day. And that story I wrote because I was sitting in a hospital one day. I was sitting at this table, and my daughter was there, and she was visiting her girlfriend, and her girlfriend was in the hospital with anorexia. So she was being treated for anorexia. She was so sick that her heart had stopped working properly. And so she was being treated, and it was a good thing. We were all very happy that she was there. But I was sitting there, and I was mad at myself because I always carry a notebook everywhere I go. I think I have mine here today. Because around when you walk through the world, this one has Snoopy on it. This is my current notebook. But when you walk through the world, there's all kinds of interesting things that happen. And so I spend a lot of time writing notes in my notebook. And I was really mad at myself because I forgot my notebook that day. I had my pen, but I forgot my notebook. And so I was just staring into space, waiting for my daughter to finish. And this boy walked down the hall. And he was walking with his dad, and he was obviously very sick. And he was pushing his IV. Now, when you're in the hospital, I don't know if you know this, but if you're a kid and you're in the hospital for any length of time, they still make you go to school. They do. They'll bring a teacher into the hospital. She'll talk to your teacher at school. She'll make it, they make it work so that you still go to school. So this kid was walking down the hall, and he was walking with his dad, and he was pushing his IV pole. And I could tell that he was so angry. And we happened to, you know when you're walking past somebody on the street, you don't even know them, but you might catch their eye. And he caught my eye. And as we looked at each other for that brief second, I had the entire plot for Miss Zephyr's notebook inside my head. And I had no book to write it in, and I was so mad. And so this kid walked on with his dad around the loop that he was getting his exercise before he had to go back to do his schoolwork. And so I grabbed, the only thing on the table was an empty Kleenex box. So I ripped open this Kleenex box, and I wrote out the plot from Miss Zephyr's notebook on the inside of this Kleenex box, and then I went home and started writing the book. So sometimes that happens. It's rare, but it's lovely when it happens. Yes?
What inspired you to write books?
I think it's because I like to read. When I was a little kid, when I was your age, I was on no teams. The only thing I could do was swim, so I don't drown if I'm in water. But I am the klutziest person you've ever. Have you seen? Like I've tripped like about nearly 5 times while I've been reading to you today. I'm a klutzy, uncoordinated person. I have no skill as an athlete, but I love to read. And so so I specialized in reading when I was growing up. I learned how to read. I can walk down the street reading a book and not hit a single person or a phone pole. And I think that's why I started writing. I do. Yes?
What was your favorite book to write?
Oh, you know, that's a tough question. That's kind of like saying what's your favorite child, you know? My favorite book is always the one that I'm working on right now. So right now, the one I'm working on is a book about a girl named Kaylee. This is my steampunk novel, and that's my favorite one right now. Yes.
What was your favorite book you ever read?
Oh, that's another hard one. That's a tough one. Okay, I'll tell you what my favorite book was when I was your age. How's that? And that was called The Once and Future King. And it is still my favorite book, I think, almost of every book I've ever read. So if you have not read it, you might have come across it because Walt Disney took it and kind of wrecked it and took the first part, and it's called The Sword and the Stone. And it's the story of King Arthur and when he was a little boy. And the very first part of The Once and Future King is a lovely story of what happens when Arthur meets Merlin, his teacher. And Merlin is so interesting, and he has an owl, and he has a nest in his beard, and he has birds poop in his hair, and maybe that's why I write the way I do. I blame T.H. White. Anyway, it's a fantastic story, but The Once a Future King itself, the whole story is a very sad story. It's a tragedy, because it's a story about Camelot and how Camelot grew to become the most amazing, mysterious, beautiful kingdom, and then it ended. And so it's essentially a very sad story. Okay.
Do you like to read your other friends' books?
Oh yeah, I've got lots of friends who are writers, and I read all their books, and I recommend them like mad. So I'm on a tour later this week. After I'm finished with the Fraser Valley, I'm going to Penticton with a friend of mine whose name is James McCann. And James is an amazing writer, and he likes to write books about vampires and werewolves. So you look up his name, you'll find some good books. Yes? Did you forget?
Who's your favorite writer?
Who's my favorite writer? Well, I like T.H. White. There's so many writers that I've had, you know, that I think are just amazing. Like, I like really scary books to read. I like reading Stephen King for sure. But you know what? He's not my favorite writer. There's amazing books. Recently, I've been on a P.G. Wodehouse kick, and so I just love P.G. Wodehouse. And he is an old guy. He died before I was even born, but he writes very, very funny books about these two characters named Jeeves and Wooster. So those are the ones I'm reading right now. Yes? Yeah, go ahead.
What time period did you go into?
Oh, that is such a good question. Oh boy. I don't know. I really do like the time of the plague. Like the story that I'm working on right now has a big plague function in it. The idea of the plague is interesting to me because the plague was, when the Black Plague was sweeping through Europe, it was a time when people lived very, very hard lives. Already, lives were very hard. If you were 13 or 14 years old, anybody here 13 yet? Okay, one or two 13-year-olds here. If you were that old, Danny, you would be married by now, and your mom would be mad about it. No, she would be happy. She would have married you off. You would be an obligation to her. Life was very different in those days. It was a really tough life. There was no aspirin if you had a headache. There was no Tylenol. There was no refrigerator for your food. If the reason that people were very fond of spices was that they would put spices on their meat so that they could eat rotten meat, so that it made it taste not so bad. Life was very hard already. And then along came this tiny little bacterium, and it was called Yersinia pestis, and it could only exist in the gut of a flea. And inside a flea, it lived a perfectly happy life. But as soon as that flea drank the blood of a human being, the flea would take its proboscis and it would stick it into your arm, and it would drink your blood, just the way fleas do. And as it drank your blood, it would first give you a little squirt of anesthetic so you wouldn't slap it and feel that it was there. And with that little squirt, it would exchange its own body fluid with yours, and it would put Yersinia pestis into your body. And when Yersinia pestis is in the human body, what happens is, well, the last time I told this story, I actually had someone faint, and so I won't tell the whole story. But let us say that what happens is that your body tries so hard to fight this bacterium that you get covered in bruises. And the reason it's called the Black Plague is that your glands, feel your glands right here at your neck? Human body has glands at its neck, under its arms, and girls and boys at your groin. And those glands start to swell. And if you have the plague, it swells and swells and swells, and sometimes it will swell as large as a human head, right at your neck. So if you can imagine that your head is forced back like this at your neck with this huge bruised swelling, this is what it was like to have the Black Plague. Plus, you had the worst fever you've ever had in your life. You had the worst diarrhea. You threw up everything you've ever eaten. It was the most miserable sickness ever. But it was possible to survive the Black Plague. So, I think that's period.
I just want to
most interesting. I think we're done for time. You guys have to go. So, I'm sorry. I could have gone on all day.